The snow fell in silence over the Ardennes, each flake a small miracle of stillness in a world gone mad with violence. Private First Class Isaiah Washington crouched behind the shattered trunk of an oak tree. His M1 Garand clutched against his chest and watched his breath crystallize in the frozen air. His fingers, wrapped in wool gloves that had long since soaked through, had gone numb an hour ago. He flexed them mechanically, forcing blood into the tips, knowing that when the moment came, and it always came, he would need them responsive, quick, alive. Around him the forest stretched in skeletal silence. The trees stood like burned matches against the gray December sky, their branches stripped bare by artillery fire. Snow covered everything, the fallen logs, the craters, the frozen bodies of German soldiers they'd passed 2 kilometers back. It covered them like a benediction, like God's own attempt to make the world clean again. Washington, the whisper came from his left. Sergeant Davis, a lean man from Alabama with eyes that had seen too much, gestured forward with 2 fingers. Movement. 100 meters. Isaiah nodded, his heart accelerating despite the cold. He'd been in Belgium for 3 weeks now. Attached to the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, one of only 2 all-black artillery battalions in the European theater. They weren't supposed to be here this far forward. Black soldiers were meant to drive trucks, unload supplies, dig latrines. The army had made that abundantly clear. But the German offensive had changed everything. When Hitler's panzers came screaming through the forest in mid-December, desperate to split the Allied lines, every man with a rifle had been thrown into the breach. Even black men. Especially black men, though no one would say it that way. He adjusted his position, ignoring the sharp pain in his lower back where he'd slept on frozen ground for 6 consecutive nights. Through the trees he could see them now. Gray forms moving through the white landscape, hunched and shambling. German soldiers. He counted 8, maybe 9. They moved without formation, without the crisp military bearing that Wehrmacht was famous for. These were men at the end of something. They're pulling back, Davis whispered. Probably got separated from their unit when we hit that convoy yesterday. Isaiah studied them through the falling snow. One was limping badly. Another had his arm in a makeshift sling. They wore the field gray uniforms of the regular army, not the SS, and they carried their rifles like burdens instead of weapons. Defeated men. Desperate men. Behind Isaiah, the rest of the patrol waited. 6 more soldiers from his battery, all black, all cold, all wondering if they'd make it through another day in this frozen hell. They'd been sent to scout enemy positions, but the lines had become so fluid, so chaotic, that nobody really knew where the front was anymore. Sometimes you were behind German lines without knowing it, sometimes the Germans were behind yours. We take them? Asked Corporal Jimmy Hayes, a quick-witted kid from Detroit who'd lied about his age to enlist. He was 19 and looked 50. Davis considered. Taking prisoners meant slowing down, meant risk, meant bringing enemy soldiers back to American lines where the dynamics would shift in complicated ways. But leaving them meant they might regroup, might kill Americans tomorrow. We take them, Davis decided. But stay sharp. Could be a trap. They moved forward through the snow, weapons raised, fanning out in a loose semicircle. Isaiah's boots crunched through the frozen crust, each step deliberate. His hands had stopped shaking. They always did when action came, and his mind had narrowed to that sharp, focused place where everything became clear and simple. Live or die. Kill or be killed. The complex moral architecture of the world reduced to its most primitive foundation. The Germans saw them at 50 meters. Isaiah watched recognition dawn on their faces, not just surprise at being discovered, but something else, something deeper. The Germans stopped walking. One of them raised his hands immediately, his rifle tumbling into the snow. Others followed, slower, more reluctant, but they all stared. They stared at Isaiah and his brothers like they were seeing ghosts. Hand hoch, Davis shouted, one of the few German phrases they all knew. Hands up. The Germans complied, but they didn't stop staring. Isaiah had seen this reaction before, the shock of white Europeans encountering black American soldiers for the first time. The French had been curious, sometimes friendly. The Belgians had been wary but accepting. But these Germans looked at them with something beyond surprise, something closer to bewilderment, bordering on horror. Move in slow, Davis ordered. Hayes, get their weapons. Washington, cover the tree line. Isaiah positioned himself at an angle, his rifle trained on the forest beyond the prisoners. This was the dangerous moment when you were focused on the enemy in front of you and vulnerable to the enemy you couldn't see. His eyes scanned the shadows between the trees, looking for movement, for the glint of metal, for anything that didn't belong. Behind him he could hear Hayes collecting rifles and pistols, the clatter of metal on metal as weapons hit the ground. The Germans spoke in rapid, frightened bursts, spleeting, explaining, begging. Isaiah didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He'd heard it before, that universal language of fear. "Search them," Davis ordered. This was always ugly. American soldiers patting down enemy soldiers, taking watches, cigarettes, photographs, letters, looking for intelligence but also for souvenirs. Isaiah had seen men take gold teeth from corpses. He'd seen worse. War stripped away the thin veneer of civilization, left you with something raw and primitive underneath. He kept his position, his back to the prisoners, trusting his brothers to handle it. The snow continued to fall, heavier now, thick flakes that caught in his eyelashes and melted against his dark skin. His mother's voice echoed in his memory, warm and distant. "You stay safe, Isaiah. You stay alive and you come home to me." That had been in Charleston, South Carolina, a lifetime ago, back when he'd still believed the Army might treat him like a man. He'd learned differently. "Washington, we need you!" The voice was Davis's, tight with tension. Isaiah turned, lowering his rifle slightly. The Germans were on their knees now, hands clasped behind their heads, but something had changed. The atmosphere had thickened, grown strange. The prisoners were still staring at him, but their expressions had shifted from shock to something else. Fascination, confusion, fear mixed with morbid curiosity. One of them, a young soldier with hollow cheeks and frightened eyes, was speaking rapidly to his comrades, pointing at Isaiah. The others were responding, gesturing, arguing in low, urgent voices. "What's going on?" Isaiah asked. "I don't know," Davis said, "but they keep looking at you. Keep saying something I can't make out." Hayes, who'd picked up a smattering of German from a girlfriend in Paris, listened carefully. His face darkened. "They're talking about ... I think they're saying he's burned. That Washington's burned." Isaiah felt something cold slide down his spine that had nothing to do with the December weather. Burned? The young German soldier was still pointing, still talking. Another prisoner, older, with corporal stripes on his tattered uniform, reached out suddenly, not threatening but tentative, almost reverent. His hand extended toward Isaiah's face. "Back off!" Davis barked, stepping forward. For the German kept reaching, kept speaking in rapid, agitated German. His finger pointed at Isaiah's cheek, his jaw, his hands. The other prisoners were leaning forward now, all of them focused on Isaiah with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Hayes listened again, his face twisting with something between anger and disbelief. "Jesus Christ. They think it's dirt. Or soot. They're saying his skin is burned or covered in something. They've never ... Single quotes. The realization hit Isaiah like a physical blow. These men had never seen a black person before. Not in life, not in photographs, nowhere except perhaps in the Nazi propaganda that painted them as subhuman monsters. To these provincial German boys from some isolated village in Bavaria or Saxony, Isaiah Washington wasn't just an enemy soldier. He was something inexplicable, impossible, a human being whose very existence contradicted everything they'd been taught about the world. The older corporal said something pleading, insistent. He made a rubbing motion with his hand like washing. "He wants a ... single quote," because Hayes couldn't finish the sentence. "He wants to wash you, to clean your face. He thinks you're covered in something." The world seemed to stop. The snow hung suspended in the air. Isaiah stood frozen, his rifle forgotten, staring at these German prisoners who wanted to wash him, who thought his skin was temporary, removable, something that could be scrubbed away to reveal the white person they assumed must be underneath. Rage rose in his throat, hot and bitter. But something else came with it, something more complicated. Not pity exactly, but a recognition of the vast, terrible ignorance that had shaped these men's lives. They'd been born in a country that taught them lies, fed them poison, sent them to die for a madman's dreams. They'd never questioned, never doubted, never seen beyond the borders of their own limited experience. Just like America, he thought suddenly. Just like the America that sent black men to fight for freedom while denying them that same freedom at home. Just like the America where he couldn't drink from certain water fountains, couldn't sit in certain train cars, couldn't look white men in the eye without risking violence. These German prisoners were ignorant, yes, but what did that make America? "Washington," Davis's voice was careful, controlled. "You don't have to. It's fine," Isaiah heard himself say. The words came from somewhere deep, somewhere he didn't fully understand. He stepped forward, moving slowly, deliberately. The German corporal watched him approach with wide, fearful eyes. Isaiah set his rifle down carefully, then pulled off his glove. His hand looked almost black against the white snow, the deep brown of his skin rich and dark and undeniable. He held it out. "Go ahead," he said quietly, knowing they couldn't understand his words, but hoping they'd understand his tone. "Touch it." The German hesitated, looked at his comrades, then reached out with trembling fingers. His hand made contact with Isaiah's skin, tentative, fearful, reverent. He rubbed gently as if expecting the brown to smear, to fade, to reveal something else underneath. It didn't. The German's eyes widened. He rubbed harder, more insistently, his breath coming faster. His fingers pressed against Isaiah's palm, his wrist, his forearm. He pulled up Isaiah's sleeve, exposing more dark skin, and the confusion on his face deepened into something approaching wonder. The other prisoners watched in absolute silence. One of them murmured something that might have been a prayer. Isaiah stood motionless, letting this German boy, because that's what he was, just a boy, maybe 20 years old, explore the truth of his skin, letting him learn what propaganda had hidden, what isolation had denied. He felt exposed, violated, displayed like an exhibit in a museum. But he also felt something else. Power. Not the power of a gun or a uniform, but the power of existence itself. The power of being undeniably, irrefutably real. The German finally stopped rubbing. His hand fell away, and he looked up at Isaiah with an expression of such profound confusion and fear and dawning comprehension that Isaiah felt something crack inside his chest. "Es ist sein hot," the corporal whispered. It is his skin. Even Isaiah, with his limited German, understood those words. The other prisoners began speaking all at once, a cascade of German that rose in pitch and intensity. Some sounded angry, some frightened, some simply bewildered. They looked at Isaiah like he'd revealed himself as something supernatural, something beyond the bounds of their narrow understanding of the world. Hayes was shaking his head, his jaw clenched tight. This is fucked up. This is completely fucked up. But Davis just watched, his eyes moving between Isaiah and the prisoners. He understood, Isaiah realized. Davis had grown up in Alabama, had seen the worst of what America could do to black men. He knew that ignorance wasn't just a German disease. It was everywhere, poisoning everything, turning human beings into mysteries that needed to be solved, problems that needed to be addressed, threats that needed to be contained. Isaiah pulled his sleeve back down, suddenly exhausted. The rage had drained away, leaving only a hollow ache. "We should move," he said quietly. "It'll be dark soon." They bound the prisoners' hands with parachute cord and formed up to march them back toward American lines. But something had shifted in the dynamic between captors and captured. The Germans kept looking at Isaiah as they walked, their eyes tracking his movements with an obsessive focus. Some seemed frightened still, as if his very presence represented something dangerous and unknowable. Others seemed almost curious, their propaganda-trained minds struggling to reconcile what they'd been taught with what they now knew to be true. The march took 3 hours through deepening snow. Isaiah walked point, his rifle ready, his mind churning through the encounter over and over again. He thought about his father, a sharecropper in South Carolina who'd never owned the land he worked, who'd taught Isaiah to lower his eyes when white men passed. He thought about his mother who'd worked as a domestic servant in Charleston, cleaning white people's homes, raising white people's children while her own son learned to read in a segregated school with hand-me-down textbooks. He thought about the recruiting officer who'd welcomed him into the army with a smile, then assigned him to a segregated unit where white officers gave the orders and black men took the bullets. He thought about fighting for a country that didn't believe he was fully human. And now here were these German prisoners, enemy soldiers from a nation built on the explicit belief in racial hierarchy, discovering for the first time that black people actually existed, that their skin was real and permanent and part of who they were. The irony cut so deep it made him want to laugh and scream simultaneously. Night had fallen by the time they reached the American checkpoint. The sky had cleared, revealing stars that glittered like ice chips in the darkness. Isaiah's unit was challenged by a white infantry squad manning a roadblock, young men from some Midwestern state, their faces pink with cold under their helmets. "Halt. Identify yourselves." "Sergeant Davis, 333rd Field Artillery, with 9 German prisoners," Davis called back. The white soldiers emerged from their positions, rifles ready. Their eyes widened when they saw Isaiah and his brothers, then widened further when they saw the prisoners. The dynamic shifted again, the racial hierarchy reasserting itself like gravity. Suddenly it wasn't just American soldiers and German prisoners. It was white American soldiers, black American soldiers, and German prisoners. 3 distinct categories with 3 distinct positions in the unspoken order of things. "You boys did good," the white sergeant said, his tone condescending in that particular way that made Isaiah's teeth clench. "We'll take them from here. We need to get them processed," Davis said carefully. "Intelligence will want to," I said. "We'll handle it." The white sergeant's voice had hardened. "You can head back to your unit now." Isaiah watched this exchange, feeling the familiar burn of humiliation and rage. They'd captured the prisoners. They'd marched them through enemy territory. But now white soldiers would get the credit, would handle the interrogation, would write the reports. The 333rd would get a footnote at best, if they got mentioned at all. But as the German prisoners were led away, the young corporal, the one who'd tried to wash Isaiah's skin, turned back. He looked at Isaiah for a long moment, his face illuminated by the harsh light of the checkpoint. Something passed between them, something Isaiah couldn't quite name. Not friendship, certainly. Not understanding exactly, but acknowledgement. Recognition of a shared humanity that transcended nationality, transcended war, transcended even the vast ignorance that had brought them to this moment. Then the corporal was gone, swallowed by the darkness and the snow. They marched back to their battery positions in silence. Isaiah's mind replayed the encounter endlessly, turning it over like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. It's the German's fingers on his skin, the shock in those frightened eyes, the dawning realization that everything they'd been taught was a lie. But was it any different in America? He thought about the segregated train cars he'd ridden to get to boot camp, the separate water fountains, the back entrances to restaurants, the lynchings that still happened, that everyone knew about but nobody stopped, and the fundamental American belief that black people were lesser, different, dangerous, not quite human in the way that mattered. The Germans had propaganda that told them lies about black people, but America didn't need propaganda. It had laws. It had customs. It had centuries of practice in treating black Americans as problems to be managed rather than citizens to be respected. At least the Germans had the excuse of ignorance. What was America's excuse? They reached their battery position near dawn. The gun crews were sleeping in improvised shelters, canvas tarps stretched over holes dug in the frozen earth. Isaiah collapsed into his own shelter, too exhausted to even remove his boots. He closed his eyes and saw the German corporal's face, saw those fingers rubbing his skin, saw the confusion and fear and wonder. He dreamed of his mother's house in Charleston, the small wooden structure with its tin roof and bare floors. He dreamed of sitting on the front porch with his father, watching the sun set over land they didn't own. His father was speaking, but Isaiah couldn't hear the words over the sound of artillery fire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He woke to someone shaking his shoulder. Hayes crouched beside him, his face serious. "Captain wants to see you." Now, Isaiah stumbled through the pre-dawn darkness to the command post, another hole in the ground, this one covered with logs and dirt. Captain Morrison, a white officer from Pennsylvania, sat behind a makeshift desk constructed from ammunition crates. He looked up when Isaiah entered, his expression unreadable. "Private Washington." "Sit down." Isaiah sat on a crate, his hands folded in his lap. He'd learned long ago to make himself small in the presence of white officers, to take up as little space as possible, to speak only when directly addressed. "I heard about what happened yesterday," Morrison said. "With the prisoners." Isaiah said nothing. What was there to say? The intelligence officer who debriefed them got an interesting story. Apparently they'd never seen a Negro soldier before. "Thought your skin was dirt or burns." Morrison paused. "Tried to wash you." "Yes, sir." "How did that make you feel?" The question surprised him. White officers rarely asked black soldiers how they felt about anything. He considered lying, giving the answer he thought Morrison wanted to hear. But exhaustion and anger and something else, something deeper and more defiant, made him speak truthfully. "Made me feel like I was fighting two wars, sir. One against the Germans and one against ignorance. Made me wonder which war was harder to win." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the morning guns were starting their daily symphony, the deep boom of 155mm howitzers that shook the earth and rattled the teeth. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "I grew up in a neighborhood where there were no colored people. Not one. I didn't meet a Negro until I was 17 years old." He looked at his hands. "I joined the army because I believed in something. Freedom. Democracy. The idea that all men are created equal. But then they told me I'd be commanding a colored artillery battery. And I'll be honest with you, Washington, I didn't know what to think. Everything I'd been taught suggested you boys couldn't handle it. Couldn't handle the responsibility, the discipline, the technical knowledge required to operate the guns." Isaiah listened without expression, his face carefully neutral. "You've proven me wrong," Morrison continued. "You and every man in this battery. You've fought as hard as any white unit I've served with. Harder, maybe, because you have more to prove." He leaned forward. "What happened yesterday with those prisoners, it wasn't just ignorance on their part. It was a kind of awakening. Those men went their whole lives never questioning what they'd been taught about race, about who was human and who wasn't. And then they met you, and suddenly everything they believed was revealed as a lie. With respect, sir, the same thing happens in America every day, except we don't have the excuse of propaganda. We have the Constitution saying all men are created equal while treating some men as less than others." Morrison's jaw tightened. For a moment, Isaiah thought he'd gone too far across some invisible line, but then the captain nodded slowly. You're right. And maybe that's what this war's really about. Not just defeating Hitler, but defeating the idea that some people are worth more than others because of the color of their skin or where they were born. He stood up, extending his hand. Thank you for your service, Private, and for your patience with men who should know better. Isaiah shook his hand, feeling the firm grip, the calluses that came from hard work. It was such a simple gesture, a white officer shaking hands with a black enlisted man. In civilian life, in the South where Isaiah had grown up, such a thing could get a black man killed. But here in a frozen hole in Belgium, surrounded by the machinery of war, it felt like something more. Not equality, not yet, but possibility. The faint outline of a future where such gestures might be unremarkable. The war ground on. The German offensive stalled, then collapsed. American forces pushed forward through snow and mud and blood. Isaiah and his brothers in the 333rd kept firing their guns, kept holding their positions, kept proving themselves over and over again to men who would forget their contributions the moment peace came. But Isaiah never forgot that December morning in the Ardennes. Never forgot the German corporal's fingers on his skin, rubbing desperately, trying to wash away a reality that wouldn't be denied. In the years that followed, after the war ended, after he returned to an America still segregated and still unequal, after he joined the growing movement for civil rights, he often thought about that moment. Those German soldiers had been raised in a system that taught them lies about human beings. They'd been shaped by propaganda and isolation and the deliberate suppression of truth. But when confronted with reality, when forced to acknowledge the humanity they'd been taught to deny, some of them had changed. Not all change was never universal, never complete, but some had looked into Isaiah's eyes and seen a man where they'd expected to see a monster. If Germans could learn, could change, could grow beyond the lies they'd been fed, then surely Americans could do the same. If a Nazi soldier could recognize the humanity of a black man, then surely white Americans could recognize the humanity of their black neighbors, their black colleagues, their black fellow citizens. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. The deeply embedded prejudices of centuries didn't dissolve overnight. But that morning in Belgium had taught Isaiah something important. Ignorance was not inevitable. It could be challenged, confronted, overcome. Not through violence or rhetoric, but through the simple, undeniable fact of existence. By living, by serving, by refusing to be anything less than fully human, black Americans were forcing the country to confront its own propaganda, its own carefully constructed illusions about race and humanity. The German corporal had tried to wash away Isaiah's skin because he genuinely believed it was temporary, removable, unreal. What he'd discovered instead was that his own beliefs were what needed to be washed away. The dirt wasn't on Isaiah's skin. It was in the minds of men who'd been taught to see human beings as less than human. And that dirt, Isaiah knew, was the hardest kind to clean, but it could be done. It had to be done. Not just for black Americans, but for everyone, because a country that practiced inequality poised itself, limited its own potential, betrayed its own founding ideals. The German prisoners had learned that lesson in a forest in Belgium. America would learn it too, eventually. The only question was how long it would take and how much suffering would be required before the lesson finally took hold. Isaiah Washington went home after the war. He returned to South Carolina to segregated train cars and water fountains and the back entrances of restaurants. But he returned as a man who'd been tested in fire, who'd proven himself worthy of respect, who'd seen the world beyond the narrow confines of Jim Crow America. He returned with the knowledge that ignorance could be defeated, that change was possible. The color of a man's skin had nothing to do with the content of his character. He returned ready to fight the second war, the one at home, the one against ignorance and injustice and the fundamental betrayal of American ideals. It would be longer than the first war, harder in many ways, with victories measured in inches rather than miles. But it was a war worth fighting, a war that mattered, a war that would ultimately determine whether America lived up to its promise or remained forever chained to its past. In the cold December of 1944, in a forest in Belgium, a young German soldier had tried to wash away the color of Isaiah Washington's skin and discovered instead an unchangeable truth, that humanity came in every shade, that dignity transcended race, that all men were indeed created equal regardless of what propaganda or custom or law might claim. It was a lesson the world needed to learn, and Isaiah Washington, survivor of 2 wars, would spend the rest of his life teaching it to anyone willing to listen. The snow continued to fall over the Ardennes, covering the scars of war with temporary whiteness. But underneath, the earth remained what it had always been, dark and rich and real and permanent, just like the skin on Isaiah Washington's hands. just like the truth that no amount of scrubbing could ever wash away.